Okay, yes, as Connie said, I'm really looking forward to moving back to the area and getting involved with WATESOL again. I have such good memories of my time with WATESOL before we moved to LA. Thanks for those of you joining in the chat. It's nice to see you as well, joining from Indonesia. That's awesome. Really happy to have you. I'm joining from sunny Los Angeles, California, where I'm enjoying the perfect weather for another 4 months before moving back to DC in the summer, which I'm sure will be an unpleasant surprise. So let me go ahead and get started. I wanted to start actually by asking some questions to find out what you already know. So I'm going to paste these questions in the chat and then I'll show them on the screen as well. I have a few questions related to Corpus tools. Let's go ahead and share the whole screen. Okay. So I'd like to know if you're familiar with the concept of a corpus and or maybe this is a new concept for you. Either way is fine. This is a workshop designed with not needing to have any sort of previous experience. If you are familiar with Corpora, I'd like to know if you've used any corpus tools previously in your teaching or in your research. And if so, which ones? And more specifically, whether you've ever used Skel or Lingual, because those are the two tools that we'll be working with today. So I'll give you a minute or two to answer those questions. Thanks, Connie, for putting those links in the chat. We'll get back to those in a little bit. So let's see. Okay, so Christine says that she's used Coca. So Coca is a really powerful corpus tool, but also one that takes a bit more sort of upfront commitment to learn. I do know how to use Coca and would be happy to show it to anyone who's interested, but I purposely chose a couple of tools today that are have a much lower barrier to entry that you can pretty much just open and use right away. Anyone else have any experience with Corpora or are familiar with the concept of what a corpus is? Feel free to either put it in the chat or open your mic if that is easier. Okay, Hanung is familiar with the concept of a corpus and used one for research, but it wasn't lingual. Do you remember the name of the corpus that you used? Maybe you could put it in the chat. That would be interesting to know. So I'm going to go ahead and keep moving, but I will also keep an eye on the chat to see if there are any additional answers coming in. So it sounds like among our group, we have some level of familiarity with what a corpus is, but it wouldn't hurt to do maybe a little bit of review. So that's where we're going to start. Okay, so let's talk about what a corpus is. Wordsmith tools. Yes, thank you for mentioning that. That is another corpus tool, also very powerful. One of the disadvantages perhaps is that it is not free. The corpus tools I'm going to show you today are both free. So different definitions of a corpus, but I like this one. I think it's short and to the point. Corpus is a collection of naturally occurring texts. So I want to dive into that a little bit deeper, talk about what I mean. So when I say a collection, I mean a group of texts that has been put together with something in common, some sort of a theme, right? So it might be a collection that's meant to represent a particular language variety, like COCA, the Corpus of Contemporary American English. Could be for a particular situation, like academic discourse, a certain discipline, or even a topic. I think one of the interesting ones is the coronavirus corpus. So we can have these sort of themed corpora. When I say naturally occurring, I mean something that is already in existence, something that people have already said or written, not for the purposes of linguistic study. So that's what makes these texts authentic. And when I say texts, I want to clarify that I'm not just talking about things that are written, although that might be the first thing that comes to mind. In this context, text also refers to spoken text and signed text or multimodal text. So you'll see fewer spoken corpora because it takes a lot of time and effort to transcribe spoken language. But depending on the corpus, you might just have the transcripts, or you might have the transcripts and the audio both available. The point is really that we need to have it in some sort of written form so that we can easily search the corpus, which is really what they're good for. So for that reason, a corpus is pretty much always stored on a computer or a server. It doesn't technically have to be in order to be a corpus, but that is really what makes it useful for our purposes. A few examples of the types of corpora that are relevant to us in English language teaching. If we look at written corpora, a popular area of study, one that I use in my own research actually, is academic essays written by students. We might look at research articles from a particular discipline to see what writing in that discipline looks like. If I'm teaching business English, maybe I want to look at a corpus of business emails, letters, and memos. All of these are real corpora that exist, by the way. So if you're interested in any of these, I can help you follow up on how to find them. And there are also spoken corpora that are of interest to us. So we can look at spoken responses from English proficiency tests, conversations between English language learners, transcripts of lectures from content courses, so we know how to better prepare our students for those classes. So there's really a wide variety of corpora that can be relevant for our purposes. And thinking more broadly about the applications of corpora in our field, certainly in language teaching and learning, there are a number of applications. So corpora are increasingly being used in teacher training. I personally use corpora in answering student questions about language, and we'll be doing some of that later today. And there's a lot of work when it comes to developing activities for hands-on corpus use with language learners, which is also referred to as data-driven learning. Another area that I personally think is really interesting is corpora for curriculum development. So if we're asked to teach a specialized language course, especially something that may be outside of our own field of expertise, we can compile a corpus to determine what to focus on in that curriculum. And there's some really good projects going on in this area, particularly in health sciences and in engineering. Corpora can also be used for rhetorical and literary analysis. So in my own work, I do some study of rhetorical moves in a corpus of texts. And corpora can also be used to study literary style or compare the works of different authors. And lastly, one that is actually all around us, but we don't necessarily think about all that often, is in lexicography. So if you use a dictionary, chances are that dictionary was built with corpus data. It's more or less an industry standard at this point. Okay, so I will pause there briefly just to see if there are any questions or clarifications that we need to make so far. All right then. So if we get the basic idea, let's get to the good stuff, which is the corpus tools that we're actually going to be using today. So we'll start with Skel, Sketch Engine for Language Learning, and you'll see that Connie put that into the chat if you scroll up a little bit. We have the direct link for Skel there. I'm going to jump back and forth between my PowerPoint slides and actually showing you live on Skel how this stuff works. So when you go to this site, you should see the homepage that looks like this. I'll give you a minute to do that because I think it will be easier if you sort of follow along with me as I'm doing this so that you can learn how to do what we're doing in the workshop. So let's go to Skel and let's type in a word. So let's type in the word work. You can choose from these tabs if you want, or you can just press enter because it should take you directly to the examples tab when you do that. So as we're doing this, please let me know if I need to slow down or repeat anything, or if you're having any sort of technical issues. If I don't hear anything from you, I will assume that it is working. Okay, so let's talk about what we're looking at here when we go to Skel and type in the word work. First of all, it's important to consider the sources. Anytime that we're looking at a corpus, we want to know where this language comes from. So Skel is a corpus, draws on a corpus of over 1 billion words from a variety of corpora, which you can see listed here and the number of words in each. Primarily American and British varieties, but perhaps some other varieties as well. And the feature that we're looking at right now is the examples feature. So that's what happens that's the default function when you go to the website and type in a word. So what we get when we use this feature is examples of the target word in context, which we call concordances or concordance lines. And one of the really nice things about Skel compared to some of the other corpus tools is that the examples are specifically chosen by an algorithm for language learners. So the sentences that you get should be short and simple with enough context to actually understand the word. A few things to keep in mind when you're doing this kind of search. One, it's case insensitive, so you don't have to worry about capitalization. Two, the results that you get, you probably noticed already, will include multiple parts of speech and multiple forms for that word. So we search for work, which can be a noun or a verb. So you will probably notice some of both of those in your results, and also some different forms of the word. So when you search for the base form of a word, it's going to give you related forms as well. So if we search for work, we're going to get working and worked and works. If we search for mouse, we'll also get mice. But the opposite is not true. So if I search for mice, I should only get mice. I'm not going to get mouse if I search for another form. So if you're looking for a very particular form of the word, then I would put in that word. Otherwise, if you want, different iterations of that word, then you can just use the base form. Another thing you can do here is search for phrases and not just single words. So the same way that you typed in work, you could try hard work or work ethic, and you should get a similar display of results. Okay, I was going to move on to collocations, but any issues or questions so far?
Do you know if, I assume like homographs are grouped together, like if they're spelled the same, but they have different meanings? I haven't tried it yet, but.
Correct.
Like,
yeah,
okay.
It is not smart enough to distinguish the meanings. It's very literal. It's looking for those string of characters.
Cool.
Okay, so let's look at then the next feature. I'll show this one live. We see here, if you've typed in work, the tab that's highlighted is examples. We're going to click on word sketch to go to this page. And this is, I think, perhaps the best feature of Skel. I think it's a really cool feature. What we're seeing here are the collocations using the word work in different positions, classified by parts of speech, looking at the words that come before and after work, and they're automatically arranged in descending order in terms of frequency. So the item that you see at number 1 is the most frequent word in this category, and moving down, these are less frequent collocations. So here we do have the ability to distinguish between work as a verb or a noun. So you'll see in this little drop-down menu that work is currently being shown to us as a verb. That's because it's more frequent as a verb than a noun. But we can change this to noun. And now we're looking at the collocations of work as a noun, which are obviously going to be different than work as a verb. Another cool thing here is that if I want to see examples of these phrases, I can click on the word in blue to go to examples of that. So if I wanted to see, for example, underway, if I click on underway, it takes me to example sentences with work and underway together. So we can also see how this phrase is used in a sentence. So just to go back, what I did there was if you look at any of the words in blue, you can click on them to see the examples of that word plus work in a sentence. Okay, so we looked at that already. Couple other tips. This typically doesn't work for grammatical words or function words, and it may not work for certain phrases. And as I showed you, we can select the part of speech for words that can be more than one part of speech, but the most frequent one is shown by default. Okay, still with me? So far, so good? All right. The last feature of Skel, honestly, not my favorite one, but worth showing you since we're here anyway. This is a feature called similar words, and you can get to that by choosing the third tab here, similar words. And the reason they call it similar words is very deliberate, because these are not actually synonyms necessarily. So the way that this is determined is the software looks for words that collocate with similar words as the word you're looking for. So they appear in a similar position in a sentence as the target word, and they collocate with similar words, which means that sometimes they're synonyms and sometimes they're not. So I wouldn't advertise this to your students as being a way to find synonyms. Maybe it's a way of finding words that work in a similar way as the word that you're looking for. This feature also may not be available for phrases, but you can change the part of speech, just as we did in the word sketch. So again, it defaulted to verb. I can change it to noun to see the similar words there. All right, so at this point, I wanted to take a few minutes for all of you to explore Skel a little bit. Maybe you've been doing this already, but I want you to think of a word that your students recently learned or a word that your students have trouble using. Take a couple minutes to search for that word, and then I'll ask you to report what you have found. So I'm going to mute for a minute or two, give you a chance to explore. Feel free to send me a direct message if you have any sort of questions. All right, I'm going to see if we have any brave volunteers who might be willing to share what you found. Maybe tell us what word you looked for, if you noticed anything interesting or surprising. The floor is yours. Or if you'd prefer to put it in the chat, that's fine too.
Go. We just read The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. So I looked up like terror and horror because we were doing those words today. And obviously they were both in the similar words for each other, but when you looked up horror, you got a lot of other genre words like fantasy, fiction, things like that is the genre of horror. But yeah, they had really useful collocations like strike terror into the heart of whatever, and face the terror and things. So yeah, I think this would be helpful for my students to see. We already use some tools like, Learner's Dictionary and things like that, but in terms of collocations, this is much easier to use than COCA.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. You make a really good point about when you're looking for similar words, sometimes it's very challenging to distinguish them in terms of the definition. It can be much clearer to distinguish them in terms of what words are typically found with those words, even in ways that we can't articulate sometimes. Like, it's hard to explain what's the difference between those two words, but when you look at what words come with those words, then the difference becomes more apparent. So that's a really useful application. Does anybody else want to share a word that you looked for or an observation that you had?
So are these examples that they give in with the words, are they all real life experience, real life sentences that are found in written works?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of them are higher level. I would consider higher level quotes, pieces. So I'm wondering if at what level this is useful for. I can't remember if you said that already. What level?
No, I didn't. Thanks for mentioning that. It very much depends on the age and level of your learners. I think it's appropriate for perhaps intermediate, certainly advanced. What I would recommend if you have learners who are a bit lower level is that rather than just giving them free rein to explore on their own, you run a search, pick out the examples that you think they can understand, because some of them are more understandable than others. So it's really a question of whether you think your learners are able to interact with something like this directly, or whether you sort of need to be the intermediary.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It actually brings me to my next question for everyone, which is, how do you think you might use this? Christine mentioned that a little bit, but do you see any applications of this for yourself as a teacher or for your students directly? I can share some of my thoughts on this.
I have one thought.
Yeah, go.
I've used vocabulary.com before because they have like the lower right section of any word will have example sentences. I don't know what corpus from, but it's from like news articles and stories and things. But they're not always short sentences. They're sometimes very long sentences, and they're sometimes very like no context sentences. So I've used those to like make quizzes for students instead of like me having to come up with sentences for a bunch of words if I don't have a pre-made quiz. And I think the nice thing about them being short sentences here is that I think it would be faster than clicking through a whole bunch of pages of vocabulary.com examples. So I think for quizzes for like intermediate level, it would help me make those.
Yes, that is exactly one of the things that I was going to mention. I hate writing all of these like fake contrived example sentences for, quizzes and activities. You kind of run out of things to talk about, right? So I think that it is really useful for us as teachers to find examples, real authentic examples of words in context that we can use. Another thing that I use it for is teaching collocations when introducing new words. So I really believe in introducing language in chunks rather than just, single isolated vocabulary words. But it is actually pretty challenging to know what chunks you should teach, right? Our intuitions about which ones are most frequent are actually not very accurate. So this can be a good starting place. Like, okay, I want to teach a new word and I want to teach a few collocations with this word. Which one should I teach? From the student perspective, we talked about this a little bit. If your students are at a level where they you think they can understand most of the examples, this is a really good way for them to independently explore words. I find oftentimes seeing a word in a sentence is a more effective way of understanding what it means than seeing a definition. There's certain nuances that are really only captured in context. Again, depending on the level of your learners, they may be able to self-edit by searching for appropriate collocations to express their ideas, whether that's in a first draft or perhaps they submit a draft of writing to you. Rather than correcting the writing or just saying awkward, please revise or something, you can highlight some of the phrases that sound unnatural and ask them to do some looking for a phrase that might be able to substitute for that. And in the same way, it can help the students to avoid too much repetition in writing or speech. So I want to move on to our next tool, which is Lingual. Again, I believe that was pasted in the chat earlier, but just in case, it's pretty simple, lingual.com with 2 G's. This one, it's a little bit trickier to know exactly what the sources are. They're not as transparent about it, but from what I've been able to understand, the search results come from Google Ngrams, the British National Corpus, and the New York Times annotated corpus at the very least. So again, different varieties of English, American English, British English, and probably others. So Lingual can do some of the same things as Skel, like showing examples in a sentence. I prefer Skel for examples in a sentence because the sentences are shorter. But what really makes Lingual helpful is the types of searches you can do with it. So I'm going to walk through a few examples of search terms and results. You can also find this same information on how to design searches by clicking on the question mark on the home page. So I'll just show that briefly. Okay, little question mark here takes you to a list of the symbols if you'd like to see that as I'm going through. So the first one I want to introduce is the slash, which means or. This is really helpful if a student is trying to decide which of 2 words is more frequent in general, or maybe even better, which of 2 words sounds better in a phrase. So what we have here is a screenshot of the search for receive or accept education. I can show you what that looks like. So what we see here is a comparison of receive education versus accept education. This came from a real student question that I had in the past. Do I say receive education or accept education? So first of all, we'll notice that the frequency count and overall percentage is much higher for receive education than accept education. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this is the phrase that we want. So what you'll want to do is for any search result, actually click on the result itself, and it will take you to examples of the sentence in context. Not quite as readable as it is on Skel, but at least enough for you to see how it's used and determine if that is in fact the phrase that you're looking for. So I find that to be a useful one, the search with the slash, meaning or. Another useful search term or pair of search terms in Lingual is the underscore and the asterisk. So these are similar, but slightly different. If we have an underscore, it means I'm looking for one word, any one word in that slot. And the asterisk means no words, one word, or more than one word in that slot. So a slight difference here. So pop quiz. Looking at the phrases here, do you think I searched is underscore me or is asterisk me? Anyone want to take a guess? Does this look like the underscore search with one word, or the asterisk search with 0, 1, or more words in between is and me? You can also put your answer in the chat if you're too shy to say it on the recording. So let's try it and see what it looks like. Christine gave us an answer, so let's see if she was right. So let's start with is underscore me. Okay, so what we see here is all of my search results have just one word, any word, right? Lots of different parts of speech. Any word in between is and me. So this is for a situation where, like, you know, a word should go here, but you're not really sure what that word is. The asterisk gives us more flexibility. Could be one or more words or none. So actually the top hit is just no words in between this phrase. But we also see examples with one word in between, two words in between, and so on. Okay, so far so good. Any questions? All right. The next search term that I think is useful is the question mark. So this is for situations where I'm not sure if I need a word here or not, especially helpful for prepositions. I'm sure many of you have heard our learners say, like, we discuss about the problem. So if they have enough intuition to think, I'm not really sure whether I need about there or not, you can use a question mark search, which will give you the results with and without that word. So in this case, if we run the search discuss question mark about, okay, no space, like it's one word, we see that discuss is overwhelmingly preferred. But there are a number of hits for discuss about. So let's take a look at that one on the site, see why that might be. Okay, so we can always click on the search results to see examples in a sentence. And I think if we look through this, you would probably say that some of these are usages that you might find ungrammatical, but some of them are not. It might depend on what words come before and after that influence this phrase. So this brings us to an important point about using any sort of corpus tool, which is that anything you find in a corpus was written by a real person, not for the purposes of English language teaching, and therefore you will find some things that you'll consider to be mistakes. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I personally think it's good to expose our learners to real sentences that people say and write, and real people don't talk like our textbooks say they do. But it is something to be aware of, that you will find some in any of these. It's not just lingual. In any sort of corpus resource, you're going to find some sentences that you might not want to be a model for your students for a couple of reasons, and we'll get back to more of those reasons later. Okay, so we're almost done with the search terms. I think this is the last one I wanted to show you, is about parts of speech. So this can be helpful if you know what kind of word you need, but not specifically which word. So we can look for verbs, noun, adjectives, adverbs. But the ones that I think are maybe the most useful for our students are prepositions and determiners, which are really hard to figure out which ones go with which words. So if I search for example, insecure, followed by prep, P-R-E-P, period, I'm going to get a list of the most common prepositions that follow the word insecure. And most of the time, there are several prepositions that could work depending on what I'm trying to say. So again, I would recommend that you have the students actually click on the search results to look through the examples and see what it is you want them to use. Same thing with determiners. We can see which articles or possessives, for example, are used with different phrases. Okay, so that brings me to my challenge for you. I will paste these in the chat in just a moment. I want you to think about what kind of search you could write to answer the following student questions using Lingual. So these are all real questions that students have asked me in the past that I've answered using Corpus tools. So let me, I'm going to stop my sharing here and just put these questions directly in the chat. And I'll give you a few minutes to work on finding some answers. And we're a small group here, so if anyone wants to speak up and ask a question, that's fine too. Let me just copy these in. And you may find that there's more than one way to get to the answer that you're looking for. Okay, so I've got those 3 questions there. I'll give a few minutes of working time. Feel free to open your mic if you have any questions or send me a direct message. That's fine too. All right, hopefully that gave you enough time to explore these searches for a little bit. I thought we could go through them together. I can sort of drive and show you what it looks like if you can suggest some searches for me. So what search do you think we can do to answer the question, which prepositions can I use after the verb dream? Feel free to open your mic or type in the chat how you think we could search for answers that would help us with that question. Okay, thank you, Christina. So let me I will share my screen so we can see the search that Christina just shared with us. So if I search for, oops, didn't copy. Let's try that again. Dream prep. Let's see what we get. Right. So interestingly, there are actually a lot of prepositions that we can use to search, that we can use after dream. So just getting these results is probably not enough to answer the student's question. In order to do that, I would want to click on some of the search results, go in and investigate them to see which one is the best one to match the type of meaning that I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. What about our next question? Should I say keep accuracy or maintain accuracy? Does someone want to put in the chat how we might do that search? And I will replicate your search for everyone to see. Okay, thanks. Christine suggested a search for us. I'm gonna type that in because it doesn't seem to want me to copy it, but I assure you it's the same one that she wrote. Okay, so we see here that maintain accuracy is overwhelmingly preferred over keep accuracy. Again, I always think it's good to look at the search results, but a lot of the time, the more frequent one is going to be the one that the student is looking for. Awesome. Okay, what about our final search? When do we use the phrase be of plus noun, and what does it mean? I got this question from a student, and this was a really good opportunity to use a corpus because I couldn't really think of the answer off the top of my head. It was hard to think of examples of what this phrase looked like, but once I saw them, it made it a lot clearer. So how might we search for something like this?
I had to click the question mark to review for this one. This one took me for a second, but I think that worked fine.
Okay, so let's try that. Right, so we see some phrases here: be of interest, be of use, be of assistance, be of value, be of service, be of benefit. So I don't, so as Christina mentioned, it doesn't directly answer the question, when do we use it and what does it mean? That definitely takes some interpretation. But I think when we see these phrases, some patterns start to emerge. Like, do you notice certain types of words seem to fit in this slot? I don't mean grammatically, I mean they're nouns. I mean in terms of the meaning, do you notice any patterns here? Words with similar meanings, like value, assistance, help, service, benefit. Right, positive connotations, exactly. It's not exclusively positive connotations, like be of concern, for example, but I think one thing that we can do is help our students notice these sort of patterns, not just grammatical patterns, but patterns on the level of meaning. So noticing when these words might group together, and then looking at some of the examples of the words in the sentence. So I don't remember exactly what I told this student when she asked me that question, but I know that when she first asked me, I thought, be of noun, what is that? I can't think of any. I ran the search, saw some examples that sort of jogged my memory. And then we looked at the specifics together to see, what sorts of contexts this appears in. So corpus searches don't necessarily give us the why, but I think when they give us the what, it can help us sort of get to the why, which is why they're valuable. So let me just wrap up the last couple slides here, and then I save some time for questions. A few limitations to keep in mind, and we've talked about a couple of these, but I want to make sure that they're clear. Oh, let me mention this quickly first. So to summarize, We as teachers can use Lingual to answer our own questions about language and test our own intuitions about the frequency of different words and collocations, which, as I mentioned earlier, are not always accurate. Our intuitions are shockingly inaccurate, actually. When it comes to frequency, we tend to not really notice the items that are most frequent. They fly under the radar. And for students, again, depending on their level, I think some of them can answer their own questions about what is frequent or infrequent and use this kind of tool to self-edit for both grammar and word choice. So in terms of the limitations, as I mentioned, corpus data comes from real people. Real people make mistakes. I mean, think about it. If we have a corpus of 1 billion words, no one is going through and editing them for accuracy. Thinking about the varieties of English, these may or may not be appropriate to your teaching context, particularly when it comes to like British English or American English may have some important differences here. It's also important to note that the search results are not filtered for appropriateness. You may have noticed that in some of your searches. So if you're working with K through 12 learners, depending on their age, you may want to preview some of the searches yourself ahead of time, or sort of pre-filter the results and present it to them directly rather than having them look in the corpus if you think the content might be inappropriate or offensive. And lastly, I wanted to mention that I think frequency is really helpful in making decisions about teaching and writing, but it's clearly not the only factor to consider. This is not a magical fix-it tool where the most frequent item is automatically the item that we want. We need to teach students to look deeper and analyze more than that. Okay, so with that said, I wanted to share some resources. First is just my personal email. I would love to talk about anything and everything corpus related, so feel free to reach out directly. I also have some resources about Skel and Lingual, and I do have some time for questions now. I assume we'll be able to share these slides. I'll talk to Connie about that, but I assume we'll be able to share the slides with the participants so that you'll have access to these resources. So let me stop my share and open it up for questions or comments or ideas.
Hey, may I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
Well, okay. It's very early here in the morning, and I'm still, but it's okay. I'm always interested with the use of corpora or corpus, and indeed, I at the time planned to use this as my dissertation, but my professor said about this method using corpora as something really new here in Indonesia. And first of all, he asked me about, you call this approach of research as quantitative or qualitative if we use corpora? And that's the first question. And I am not really sure how to answer this. It will be quantitative or qualitative, because looking at the corpora machine, it's talk about statistic, right? It's about percentage of use and thing like that. So for me, it's more like quantitative research. But then we describe the pattern, and it's more of qualitative, something like that. And second problem with us here in Indonesia using corpora is that there is still not many collection of corpus here in Indonesia, and I don't think soon we will have that kind of thing, that kind of data for us, different to what you have in America. You have plenty of data. So the question is, how much data is enough or enough for research on something? So because with corpora we can have very big data, but also we can have small data of corpora, right? So sorry if this question does not really relate to your presentation now,
No,
but
it does.
to ask that question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. I'd love to talk about corpora in research because that's what I'm doing. I think you answered your own question about whether it's quantitative or qualitative, and you answered your own question very well. It is quantitative when we're looking at, raw frequency, distribution, collocations, things like that. But it is qualitative when we analyze why an item is more frequent in certain situations or what function this structure serves, for example. So I would say part of the analysis is quantitative and part of it is qualitative. It is both, as you said.
Okay.
In answer to your second question, I do know of some corpus work in Indonesia. My impression is that it is increasing, like it is growing. I believe, I'd have to check, but I believe that one of my classmates at the university where I study by distance learning is also in Indonesia. I'm not sure if she's doing work on Indonesian corpora or English corpora, though. I'd have to check. What I would say about that is I've noticed in the field a growing demand for corpora in languages other than English in terms of conferences and funding. So it might be a big project, but it seems like there is an interest and a need in that kind of project. So I would say do it.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks
Thank
so
you,
much.
Lily.
Yeah. Anybody else have questions or comments, ideas?
I just have a comment and partly a question on how do you handle, you have frequency, you can have a very frequent usage that is not technically standard American English or standard English, but it's common. Do you explicitly address students, or even it could be different, like what Christine, I think, said something about, whether you use dream about or dream of, could be a regional thing, even within the United States. I was raised in the Boston area, lived for many years in Chicago, and I'm now in Baltimore. And so I have, hear different, occasionally I had to talk to students, well, I say it this way, but that's because I'm from originally. So, but do you find, the question in short is, do you find that you're, because it's real life English, that you're needing to explain much sentences that are different in one way or another?
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. I don't know that I explain that every time, but I certainly explain that up front. And I think maybe this is my personal teaching philosophy, but I think we have a responsibility to show our students quote unquote non-standard varieties of English, because unless the only thing they're ever going to do is take a standardized English test and never interact with English speakers in any other way, they're going to come across some of these usages. And I think we're doing them a disservice if we don't show them how people actually talk and write. So I try to make that clear up front. And we even talk about the difference between, prescriptive grammar and what's sort of considered standard versus descriptive grammar and what people actually say. So I think corpora are a really good way to start that conversation.
Yeah. In academics, there's one situation where I had explained to my class, well, there's, like you would say, there's 5 chairs. And that's not academically not correct. So it shouldn't be in your paper, but you will hear your college professors use that in spoken English.
Yes, myself included.
Yeah, me too. Thanks.
Yeah. Hanung, I saw your question in the chat. I'm not sure if I can answer that question, but maybe Connie or another one of the organizers can help with that. I don't know the answer. I'm just the presenter. I don't know about certificates.
Okay.
I will find out. I don't know either.
Okay. But we have the email address, so we will follow up on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. maybe since we're at the official endpoint, maybe we will end here. I actually do have a few more minutes if anyone wants to ask or chat more, but maybe we'll officially wrap things up so that we finish on time. Thanks so much to everybody who came.
Yeah, and thank you very much. Thanks to everyone. And I just wanted to mention some of our upcoming workshops. On April 30th, presenter Nancy Overman will run a workshop called Create Materials for Authentic Sources Without Giving Up Your Entire Weekend. And then on May 31st from 4 to 5, presenters Kathleen Ramos, Sujin Kim, and Joan Kang Shin will present Implementing a Multiliteracies Pedagogy with Pre-K through 12 Multilingual Learners.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Lily, I just have one more comment. Thank you. That was great. And when you went over the be of construction, and so we taught together in higher ed, and I can just imagine the specific students who like notice that in an academic article and like bring it up to you and they're like, what is this? You know, you did not tell me about this. And I was noticing that a lot of the things could be said more easily, like as an adjective, you say, this is helpful or this is useful or something. And so you can like start to have that conversation about like, well, in writing, sometimes if you want to like elevate it, you can do that. But it's one of those things that you could get through your entire career and not ever use be of noun in your writing, but you're gonna have to read it sometimes.
Yeah, totally. That is not an item that I have ever explicitly, had on a syllabus or taught. It was one of those observant students who asked me about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Hope you have a good evening.
You too. Thank you, everyone.